Week 6 Overview. The Patriarchs, from Ur to Egypt. 2 weeks ago we saw man disobey God's one command. God judged humanity. He drove man out of the Garden of Eden, away from the Tree of Life. Last week we saw how men tried to get around that judgment by building a tower whose top would reach to heaven. God intervened again by confusing men's tongues and dividing people by language. Men were divided from one another and separated from God. A bad way to start human history. Fortunately, that's not the end of the story. We'll spend the rest of this year learning how God reversed that curse. This week, we'll learn how God initiated a plan of redemption that would ultimately overcome the judgments of the Garden of Babel. Out of many fallen nations, God chose one man to found one holy nation. Through that nation, all the peoples of the earth would be blessed. We've been looking at the great ancient civilizations so far. These grew up on the major river systems, the Nile, the land between the rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates. Up until now, the land of Canaan has just been a blob on the map, at the most a trade route from one great empire to the other. It's time to start looking at Canaan a lot more carefully now. That blob on the map will become the promised land, as God calls one man out of Mesopotamia to start a whole new nation. That man was Abram. As far as we know, he began life a pagan. He grew up in a wealthy family in the city of Ur near the mouth of the Euphrates. He may have been a moon worshipper, since archaeologists believe this cult was strong in Ur, Abram's hometown. Ironically, his name means exalted father, but at the start of our story he had no children. Abram's father Terah led the family to Haran, a city way up the Euphrates River from Ur. In Genesis 12, God tells Abram to leave the land between the rivers. God made Abram a promise, actually a whole series of promises. God said, 1. He would make Abram a great nation. 2. He would bless him. 3. He would make his name great and famous. 4. Abram would be a blessing. 5. God would bless whoever blesses Abram. 6. Whoever cursed Abram would be cursed. 7. God would bless all nations through Abram. Those are 7 promises. Big, hard-to-believe promises. The amazing thing is that Abram responded in faith. He demonstrated that faith by leaving his home and heading off to Canaan. Abram believed God, and God blessed him for it. Genesis 15:6 says, "He believed the Lord, and the Lord counted it to him as righteousness." For a Christian, that faith response is all important, and we need to seize every opportunity we can to understand it more clearly. Genesis provided us with Lot as a fascinating foil for Abraham. According to the dictionary, a foil character is either one who's opposite to the main character or nearly the same as the main character. The purpose of a foil character is to emphasize the traits of the main character by contrast, and perhaps by setting up situations in which the protagonist can show his or her character traits. A foil is a secondary character who contrasts with a major character, but in so doing highlights various facets of the main character's personality. Now, Lot is that kind of secondary character, or foil, in spades. Lot's rich character is fascinating in its own right, but especially when you compare him with Abraham. Lot is not a bad man. In fact, he's repeatedly called a righteous man in the New Testament. See 2 Peter 2. He left his home and he traveled with Abram, sticking with him through thick and thin. Abraham offered hospitality to the angels when they came to visit, and so did Lot. When the men of Sodom sought to do them harm, Lot tried to protect them, to the point of offering his 2 virgin daughters in place of his guests. But Lot wasn't the same as Abraham. In Genesis 13, when Abraham offered him a choice of lands, Lot chose the easier living of a fertile valley. He pitched his tents towards Sodom, in Genesis 13:12, which is as much to say towards pleasure, ease, and the possibility of commerce. By Genesis 14:12, we hear that Lot was actually living in Sodom, a city so corrupt that its name is still a synonym for perversity to this day. Lot and Abraham parted company in Genesis 14, and that's Lot's loss, because in Genesis 15, God increased his blessings on Abraham. God made his earlier promises into a covenant. What is a covenant exactly? Covenants are like contracts in some ways, but very different in others. In a contract, 2 people make promises to each other. I promise you $100, for example, and you promise to paint my porch. The promises in a contract depend on each other. If you don't paint the porch, I don't owe you anything. And a contract can be terminated at any time if both parties agree to it. A covenant, by contrast, consists of mutual promises that don't depend on each other. The most familiar example is a marriage, at least an old-fashioned marriage. If a man promises to love his wife and she promises to love him, those promises are still binding even if one party or the other fails to do it. Your wife's failures don't let you off the hook, and vice versa. Under a covenant, your obligation to love her is just as binding as it ever was, even if she screams at you and spits in your face. When we make marriage vows, we promise to be faithful to each other until death do us part. Jesus prohibited divorce with one little exception for the case of adultery. Does that mean marriage is a covenant unless one person commits adultery? Not really. Under the Old Testament law, adultery was punishable by death. Adultery doesn't turn a marriage covenant into a marriage contract. It kills a marriage. Covenants were common in the ancient Middle East. The Hebrew word for making covenant is to cut a covenant, and one covenant ritual was to slaughter an animal, cut it in half, and walk between the pieces of it. The implication was, may God cut me in half like this cow if I break my promises to you. What's amazing about Genesis 15 is that God appears in the form of a smoking firepot and a flaming torch that moves between the pieces of Abraham's sacrifice. As far as Old Testament scholars can tell, God is telling Abraham, let me be cut in half like this cow if I violate my promise. Verse 18 of that chapter says, in the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. The Israelites in the wilderness knew this covenant-making God who appeared as a smoking firepot and a flaming torch to Abraham. They followed his pillar of smoke by day and his pillar of fire by night. It's not that Abraham was perfect, not by a long shot. Scattered through the book of Genesis are the stories of his shortcomings. Genesis 12, 16, and 20 all describe problems that his doubts caused. Just 10 verses after God called him, in Genesis 12, drought struck Canaan. Abram picked up and went to Egypt, outside the land that God was giving him. That's a problem, because God called Abram to trust in him, not trust in other things in other places. In Egypt, Abram was tempted to do the shrewd, worldly thing. He lied to Pharaoh because he was fearful of his life on account of Sarah's beauty, exposing Sarah to sexual assault and his lying to contamination. God exposed his deception. Later, in Genesis 20, Abraham takes the same shortcut with Abimelech, king of the Philistines. He was still trusting in human tricks, not the power of God. Yet God demonstrated his power once again by revealing those tricks while still protecting Sarah's honor. The most lasting damage done by Abram's doubt appears in Genesis 16, where Sarah persuades him to take her Egyptian maid, Hagar, to raise up children. Hagar gave birth to Ishmael, who grew up to be a mighty chieftain, head of 12 tribes in Arabia. Ishmael's descendants are with us today, and the conflict between the Arabs and Jews may well be the world's most lasting example of sibling rivalry. When people try to make God's promises come true by their own actions instead of waiting on him or obeying him, they sin, as Eve sinned when she ate the apple, as Abraham sinned when he tried to have a child with Hagar instead of Sarah. We're still dealing with the consequences of Eve's desire to be like God and Abraham's effort to make God's promises come true without God's help. For the next 4 years, we'll be following one particularly dark thread through the tapestry of time, the thread of sin. What does that word mean to your children? We define the term sin broadly to include any case where men or women seek to apprehend good or avoid evil in their own strength. What is the nature of sin by this definition? It's the desire to get good things in life or avoid evil things, apart from the loving help of God. Eve sinned by desiring to be wise apart from God. Adam sinned in seeking to avoid separation from Eve after she had eaten the forbidden fruit, but before he had eaten, by disobeying God and joining her in her sin. We can point to many such examples. This definition of sin may help your students identify sin more clearly in their own lives. Given this understanding of sin, Abraham's great virtue consisted of believing God and following his path to happiness. Abraham's failing consisted in trying to get hold of good without God's help. We can learn a lot about sin and doubt by studying Abraham, but that's not what he's famous for. On the contrary, Abraham is famous for his faith. In Genesis 18, the Lord comes down to earth to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. But then he said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord, by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him. Then, if there's any one verse a father ought to memorize to keep him on track for homeschooling, this may be it. I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord, by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him. Why does God want Abraham to do these things? So that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him. God is so eager to bless us. It seems he's more eager to bless us than we are eager to be blessed. But our doubt and disobedience get in the way. When we put our faith in something other than God, the promises are on hold, for God will not share his glory with another. Abram is called the father of everyone who believes, but it's not because his faith was unfailing. Perhaps he's the father of everyone who ever cried out, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." Abraham is a complex character, with strengths and weaknesses like our own. This is one way the Bible is so different from so many other religious books. It tells the failings of its greatest heroes as well as their strengths. God's faithful ways with Abraham provide real spiritual guidance for our children and ourselves.